Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show that's all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. We're still checking in on potential new dialogues, but we're going to start with an item description. Ashen Hunter attire. Old Hunter Djura's attire. Covered in ash, that has the meaning of a ritual to avoid blood. He, who was known for his relations with the workshop heretics, the Gunpowder Warehouse, was an extremely kind and foolish man. Therefore, he despaired at the horrifying scene of Old Yharnam, and stopped being a hunter. And while most of this attire has the same description, there's one different line on the headpiece. Ash Wolf Hat. This frayed wolf hat was known as being especially symbolic. But for all that there are some interesting points to me in the difference between the Grey Wolf Cap and the Ashen Hunter Set, the thing that I'd like to focus on is actually something that the first line of each piece of attire here has in common. That is, the reference in the original Japanese to Old Hunter Djura, as opposed to the official translation of Retired Hunter Djura. And the reason I want to go into this is because of how I think the underlying issue can serve to highlight how sometimes the translation process itself can be the cause of a problem. To see this, it's important to start with the knowledge that at the time of the game's initial release, there wasn't a great deal of emphasis placed on the phrase Old Hunter. From what I've been able to find, there are a total of only 20 other instances in the base game of either Furukaryudo or Furuikaryudo, the two terms that translate to Old Hunter in English, and 10 are used in relation to Henrik. What's more, while this phrase is used as a specific descriptor for 4 hunters besides Henrik, namely Gascoigne, Djura, Ludwig, and Gehrman, there are other instances where it appears to simply be a generic term for hunters of old. Under these circumstances, it seems entirely possible that the scarcity of the term meant that there wasn't much of an indication that it had any meaning besides the straightforward sense of a hunter of days gone by, and the potential association with Henrik may have created an incentive to avoid using the phrase in connection with other hunters. In other words, it's possible the shift from Old Hunter Gascoigne to Father Gascoigne, for instance, was to make both Father Gascoigne and Henrik come across as more distinct characters. After all, unique descriptors like the father in Father Gascoigne are more impactful than generic ones, which is what Old Hunter appeared to be. It was only with the release of the DLC, which was of course titled The Old Hunters, that it became clear that the term was more important. All of this to say, back when the game was initially being translated, there would have been good reason to find alternative terms to the phrase Old Hunter, especially for characters that had no relation to Henrik. So when Djura's attire also contains reference to him giving up being a hunter, it doesn't seem unreasonable to me that he would instead be referred to as Retired Hunter Djura in the base game. This emphasizes the unique role he plays in Bloodborne's story, still makes it clear that he was a hunter in days gone by, and arguably helps make Henrik more distinct by tying him more closely to the phrase Old Hunter. Of course, now that the DLC has been out for some time, it's easy to look back at the game's current form and see this as a mistake, but I think that ignores an important aspect of the translation process, especially when the translation is being done while a game is actively being developed. Translation, and language in general, is highly context-based. This means that when the context changes, so does meaning, and that change can have an impact on a translation. What's more, I think this particular shift in meaning, where the phrase Old Hunter goes from unimportant to significant, is a particularly good example of the phenomenon because longtime members of the lore community likely got to experience the same realization the translation team did as the content was updated. Imagine these kinds of shifts in meaning happening all the time, requiring you to update your concept of the story every few weeks as the developers continue to tweak the game, and you can probably get a sense for what it's like to be translating something that's changing all the time in development. This is a big part of what I mean when I say the translation process itself can cause issues. Now, having said all that, it's important to remember that this is merely my best guess as to how the process may have worked. I think it fits with what the community's uncovered through data mining, and we've already seen evidence of the Japanese script getting updated after the game's release, so I think this depiction is reasonable, but I can't be certain about it. What do you make of all this, Annalise?
Closest of kin, bearer of our blood, I welcome thee. What is thy wish?
Oh, nothing really. Just thought I'd say hi.
We await thy return, for the honor of Cainhurst.
On second thought, I did find this Blood Dreg.
More talk to be had?
Wait a minute, what am I doing? Why am I kneeling to you? Aren't we family now? And besides, I've got this Blood Dreg. I think it's time we talked face to face.
Arrant fool. Vileblood or no, forget not. We are thy queen. Bend the knee.
And what if I say no?
Vileblood or no, respect will be shown. Kneel.
No, I don't wanna.
Kneel.
All right, fine, if you're going to insist, I guess I can go back and... Ha-ha!
How sad this is. If only our life was so easily forfeit.
You seem to have the same reaction as when I attacked you before. What if I kneel again?
Well, well. Thou wearest a second face. It matters not. Our flesh is undying. Speak thy mind.
Right. Here's that Blood Dreg I got.
Thy gift pleases us.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Am I gonna get anything in return?
Let this reward be thine. Indulge thyself in our tainted blood.
Oh, great. More of your blood. Alright, I guess I'd better be going.
We await thy return. For the honor of Cainhurst.
I have to say, I really do like the imperious tone that consistently comes through in the translation here. I think it not only fits well with the Japanese, but gives Queen Annalise a lot of character. That said, what I'd really like to focus on this time is a larger issue in translation raised by one specific word choice. It's the first thing Annalise says when approached directly by a member of the Vilebloods. She calls us an errant fool. Arrant, of course, is a term that seldom sees much modern usage. It's very old, and in terms of a modern definition, it generally boils down to a negative intensifier. We're essentially being called an utter fool, though with a bit of nuance that I think is appropriate to the situation. This comes out in the Merriam-Webster definition of being notoriously without moderation. In other words, we're not just an unmitigated fool, but a fool who knows no bounds. Which seems fitting given that our transgression here is to ignore decorum and speak to Queen Annalise directly without kneeling. But the topic I'm interested in exploring here has less to do with whether or not this word choice is fitting and more to do with the usage of an unusual term in and of itself. Because one question you have to consider as a translator is what your expectations are for your audience. What sorts of word choices can you expect them to understand and accept without issue? Generally, this comes up a lot in regards to cultural specific terms, but it's not limited to them. And I've seen people criticize certain translation choices in the Soulsborne series before for being too obscure. The example that comes to mind here is the name of one of the bonfires in Dark Souls 2, which literally translates to either where the witch once was, or where the witches once were. The official translation is Old Akalar, and that second term, Akalar, is a Basque word that specifically refers to the place where witches meet. In terms of meaning then, it is spot on, but because Akalar is such an unusual term, hardly anyone is going to understand that without looking it up. Another potential example, this time from Bloodborne, would be the name of a lantern as displayed on a gravestone in the Hunter's Dream. It's called the Hypogean Jail, and it refers to the lantern in the jail you get taken to if one of the kidnapper enemies kills you. Here, the Japanese literally translates pretty straightforwardly to underground prison. This is, of course, what Hypogean Jail means, which you can figure out if you know your linguistic roots. Hypo meaning below, geo relating to the earth, and jail being the archaic spelling for jail. Intriguingly, the word hypogean or hypogeal is actually a botanical term for a type of seed germination, which makes me wonder whether it was chosen to go with some of the plant-based themes that can be found in the game, but that's something of a tangent. The relevant point here is that this information will largely be lost on most players, and what good is an accurate term if it's not accessible to the audience? Ultimately, this is the kind of question that it's hard to give a definitive answer to. I personally wasn't tripped up by either of these terms, though as I've noted in the past, some of the more obvious uses of UK-specific phrases did throw me off. I also tend to feel like the audience for these games likes to have a certain amount of mysteries to investigate and find answers to for themselves. That said, I do think the use of the term Arrant is more defensible than Hypogean Jail, since Arrant goes well with Annalise's character, but the name of the lantern lacks that kind of immediate context. Regardless of my take on these specific instances, though, the larger issues of which words to use when, in what context, and in a way your intended audience will understand and appreciate is one that comes up a lot in translation, which is why I've taken the time to address them in such detail. But there was one other aspect of Annalise's lines that I wanted to bring up before moving on. It also involves one of the first things she says to you, but this time it's if you kneel to speak with her after having drunk her blood. You may have noticed that her greeting was a little different this time, because she addresses us literally as her blood relative, and even in the official translation, she calls us both closest of kin and bearer of our blood. This is actually one of my favorite examples so far of how the official translation will sometimes present information from the original in a different form. Up until now, most references to us as a blood relative have been overridden by the term Vileblood, but now pretty much every time we kneel to speak with Annalise, we get an extended emphasis on what being a Vileblood means. Speaking of families, though, how are you doing?
Welcome home, dear. You've been very, very patient. Here you are. This will help you forget. Forget your troubles. Forget your cares.
Well, I'll take the sedative, I guess. As for the translation, it's the old woman's second line here that I'd like to look at, because I think it's a great example of how context can play an important role in shaping how something is worded. The Japanese in question takes the form of a fairly common expression, mataseta. Literally, it's a conjugation of the verb for to wait, and comes out something like, I made you wait, but it can be used in a variety of situations. For instance, a quick search of the Japanese phrase brings up 3 primary suggestions for how it and its variations might be translated into English. The first suggestion is, thank you for waiting, and relates to its use in the context of a restaurant when a seater may apologize to a customer for a wait before showing them to their table. The second example translation is, sorry I kept you waiting. Here, the context is that 2 friends had planned to meet up at a certain time, but the speaker was slightly delayed because their train was behind schedule. Then finally, in the context of answering a question about a task at work, the suggested translation is, I apologize for the delay. In other words, it's a phrase that expresses some sympathy on the part of the speaker for the listener being made to wait, usually but not always with an implied apology. So, having already seen a variety of different English wordings depending on the context, let's look at how this lines up with the lonely old deer and the situation at hand in Bloodborne. For one thing, she's mistaken us for a young child of hers, which is going to influence her tone. What's more, to get to this point, we have to have already exhausted her initial supply of sedatives, meaning she'll definitely have delivered the line, now, have some patience. Mother'll make everything better. And probably also, now, be patient. Then she goes away, and it's only once she's returned that we get the set of lines where she's supposed to express sympathy for us being made to wait. Given that context, I think you've been very, very patient works quite well. It both sounds like she's addressing a child and references her asking us to be patient earlier. Arguably, there's also the note that she leaves on her chair while she's gone to consider, but since it's possible the notes were in a different section of the original files than the dialogue, I'm not sure how applicable that is. Either way though, I think it's pretty clear how the context surrounding this somewhat generic expression has influenced the wording of the translation. And really, context is always important in translation. As I said earlier, when the context changes, so does meaning. It's just that I think this particular line is a good concrete example of that. Which, it seems to me, is also a good point to end the episode on. So, as usual, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for me, I'd be happy to hear them. Also, if you're watching this in real time, I apologize for the later than usual release, but I'm hopeful I'll still be able to get through another 2 episodes before the end of the year. I'll have a bit more to say on that subject, as well as what to expect for next year's episodes and an upcoming break from the main series in a channel update that should be releasing soon. And now that I've gotten all of that out of the way, let me close by saying Thanks for watching, everyone.